So what happened? China and the big brothers split in a, you could say it's in a way not so favorable to China. The Chinese were upset because the Russians saw U.S. was a very strong country. U.S. had strong military power. U.S. and the Soviet Union could both destroy each other. They said it's best that we have peaceful coexistence. Let's get together and see if we can't do that. And China was influenced by Mao, was revolutionary. And Mao said this is a betrayal of communist ideals, you know. We've got to take the lead here. The Soviet Union no longer in control. So Mao launched these twin disasters. One is called the Great Leap Forward. That's when the commune started. 大跃进. Da is big. They were studying the character big. And the other was the Cultural Revolution, the 文化大革命. They were just simply disasters. Millions of people died. Later, even the Communist Party criticized Mao for what they called serious mistakes of those two things. At the same time, the USSR was increasingly hostile towards China, went so far as to demand bases in China. And finally, in 1969, there were small battles, military battles fought between China and the Soviet Union, the lowest point in their relationship. So, preparing for this meeting with Nixon, China changed course. Not domestically, where you still had these disasters going on, but in foreign policy. China joined the United Nations as a permanent member. You know, why was China interested? It goes back to this ancient glory. China was #1 in the world. China should be in the UN and be a member, permanent member of the Security Council. Only 5 countries in the Security Council, the US, UK, France, Russia, and now in 1971, China. And then the other action China took, fearing this threat from the Soviet Union, Mao kind of reversed course. Instead of encouraging revolution worldwide, he invited the US president to visit China. Now we'll have a little detour here, talk a little bit about the US president. You could say he was the anti-Mao. Mao was the #1 leading communist in the world at that time. Nixon was certainly among the leading anti-communists in the United States. He made his career as a senator and a member of the House of Representatives, you know, primarily by his anti-communist credentials and by his approval of a U.S. Senator called McCarthy, who alleged that the U.S. government was filled with communists, especially the State Department. The State Department where I used to work singled out several people in the State Department, some of whom had been on the Dixie mission in China, which had correctly predicted that the communists would win the Civil War. He singled them out, said they're traitors, they should be kicked out of the State Department, and several of them were kicked out of the State Department. So that was where Nixon was coming from, strong anti-communism. And yet by 1967, just before he became president, he, in terms of foreign policy, looked at China, saw this huge country, important country with nuclear weapons, and he made this statement: we cannot afford to leave China outside the family of nations. And he linked up with a Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger. So setting the scene for this visit, the U.S. certainly felt threatened by the Soviet Union's massive nuclear arms. The Soviet Union still has a lot of nuclear arms. It's still a problem between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. China also had nuclear weapons, so the U.S. sort of could have felt doubly threatened by these two huge countries, both hostile, both with nuclear weapons. And at the same time, he had this partner in realism, Henry Kissinger. They were realistic in that they didn't try to change what was going on inside China or Russia. You could say that the idealistic view would have been, no, let's not deal with these people. These are bad people who've killed millions of their own citizens. Let's not deal with them. But Nixon and Kissinger had the idea that it's in the U.S. interest to do so. Bad as they are, they have nuclear weapons. They can cause us a lot of trouble. We need to deal with them as they are. Later we can worry about what they did internally. So, let's see, to begin my questions here, with regard to the secret trip, we have Reed. No, I will in a minute, but this is the first one, and then I'll go back to those. Let me ask Reed.
Did you stand up, please?
Good morning, Reed. You saw the question there. Who was Henry Kissinger? Why did he make this secret visit? And did it need to be secret? That's the question that historians today are still considering. What do you think?
Well, Henry Kissinger was Nixon's national security secretary, but I think it needed to be kept secret because just to avoid public pressure on the visit, and if the visit ended up being a failure, it would have been a major blow to the Nixon administration.
Okay. Good answer. The other, let's see, Mackenzie. Where are you, Mackenzie? Do you agree with Reed or
I agree with Reed.
completely?
Yeah. He said it pretty well.
Do I have a student who signed up for that question? No?
Oh, you didn't have one. Okay. Yeah, let me address this question a little bit further. So, certainly, I agree also that if the trip had not been secret, there would have been a lot of pressure on both Kissinger and Nixon because the U.S. was so solidly anti-communist. And you'd have people, especially in the right wing of the Republican Party, would have been saying, this is terrible. You're talking with the enemy. You're talking with today's Hitler. I'm sure that would have been used. That Mao is worse than Hitler. That Mao killed more Chinese. Some people still say today that Mao killed more Chinese than the Japanese ever did. Even though the Japanese fought the Chinese for 17 years. Anyway, there would have been substantial opposition in the United States. In response, though, of course, the argument would have been made that I just made. Forget what they did that's bad. They can be even worse. Even worse is if they started nuclear war. So, we have to figure some way to get through to them. And the best way is now, when they are splitting apart, China and the Soviet Union are splitting apart, let's take advantage and go out and repair to some extent our relations with China. And now we go back to the essentially the first question here. Why did Nixon visit Mao rather than the other way around? And that's Katerina. Hi, Katerina. What do you think? How come Mao didn't come to Washington?
Because Mao had heart problems, right?
Well, that's right. Yeah, he was having health problems, right?
So,
Okay.
and no one knew about it. No one had it publicly, right? So,
Okay, well, yeah, that's true. In those days, no one knew hardly anything about China. Because China was convulsed internally with the Cultural Revolution, closed its overseas embassies, it sent most foreigners home. There was a complete lack of knowledge about China. But it's also true that Mao was in bad health. Sarah,
I agree
you want
with
to add to that?
Katerina that Mao was in very bad health and he was also very secretive. He kept to his compound.
He did what?
He kept to his compound.
Kept to his compound, okay. He not only kept to his compound, he kept to his private train. He had a private train that went all over China, and wherever he went, as you say, it was a kind of a secret trip. You have a...
Yeah, I didn't sign up for this question, but I'd just like to add something. You mentioned the author mentioned reading that China, it was very proud of itself, and it thought that it was the center of the world. So if they were doing diplomacy with someone, they'd expect that the other country, sort of work worked then. Like it even said that a lot of the philosophers wouldn't travel outside the country. They thought it was the entire
Yeah.
world was inferior to it.
That's
So-
a very interesting point. You know, China saw itself as leading the world for 2,000 years. Chinese didn't want to go somewhere else. They were already home. It was the Americans that were moving west and moving all over the place, and the Europeans, the Chinese were where they belonged. And historically, other leaders would come and kowtow to the Chinese leaders. So that made it very appropriate. Are you Thomas or?
No, I'm Peter.
Oh, Peter, okay. Someone else had?
here.
Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
is that is why, like how far back does the Zhongguo, like the name of it originate?
Ooh, the name Zhongguo, I guess starting with the Qin Dynasty, 221 BC, or?
You can research that Zhongguo means Middle Kingdom. Zhongguo means, we have always, considered Zhongguo is in the center of the whole universe. That means Zhongguo. Do you agree?
Well, sure, and
I just never.
I would say about 221
Oh, yes.
before the first dynasty,
You can research.
it had a lot of small kingdoms. I'm not aware of one that was called Zhongguo at that time. The state of Lu and Zhou and places like that, but I'd say at least 2,000 years it was called Zhongguo.
Liu Laoshi, do you have any comments?
Well, I would say at the beginning of the Chinese history, Chinese has the Chinese nation has other names like Hua Xia, because we originate from Emperor Huang, the Yellow Emperor, and
Yeah.
Emperor Yan. So we have those names. But like Zhou Chou and Shan Chou before Qin Dynasty,